I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
The era of Prohibition in the United States lasted from 1920 to 1933. It is commonly known that the experimental puritanical policy did not significantly curb the average American's alcohol consumption, instead transferring the industry from legitimate business into the purview of organized crime. Drinking bootlegged liquor during the Prohibition was barely taboo, with the rich and powerful indulging as much as the common man. What this era did produce, however, was the prominence of a truly national crime syndicate, encompassing a linking of the Italian and Jewish gangs in the Northeast and South into a proper bloc. By the time 1933 came around and legal booze was flowing once again, the incredibly wealthy and by now well-organized American mob looked elsewhere to invest their nest egg. Ultimately, they chose Cuba, an ideal location to build their resorts and casinos, while Cuba would also incidentally become an important hub for European dope heading into the United States. It was Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky who had come up with the idea of Cuba as the new golden goose for the mob. He had ascended to the de facto leadership of the entire nationwide network in 1936, when his partner, Italian mobster Lucky Luciano, was found guilty on prostitution charges in New York State. The man who prosecuted him, Attorney General Thomas Dewey, later to be governor of New York as well, had been selected as an attack dog against the mob by New York Governor Herbert Lehman. And yes, that's Lehman as in Lehman Brothers Bank, the son of Meyer Lehman, one of the three Lehman brothers. And interestingly, Thomas Dewey would then release Luciano a decade later, when he was serving as governor of New York, apparently in return for Luciano's alleged wartime support in both securing the docks in New York City and providing off-the-books advice on the upcoming invasion of Sicily under the secret Office of Naval Intelligence operation known as Operation Underworld, which I covered all the way back in episode 3 of the History of the CIA series. But before then, for the decade that Luciano was locked up in the Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, or as his mob associates called it, Siberia, his partner Meyer Lansky was in charge. And what he accomplished with those millions, if not billions, of Prohibition dollars during that decade and beyond would cement the National Crime Syndicate as key players in Cuba and in ensuing anti-Castro operations all the way later in the 1960s. I want to start off today by highlighting a major source for this video and upcoming discussions about Lansky in this series and beyond. That would be the 1979 book, Meyer Lansky, Mogul of the Mob. The book, which is now out of print and somewhat difficult to find, was written based on interviews with Lansky himself by the authors, conducted during his years in Israel in the early 1970s. I will warn that at times the book does veer into somewhat of a hagiography, naturally given that Lansky was personally involved as a major source for the book. Yet it does still provide a decent look into the development of organized crime in America, and, more importantly, contains many interesting and unique details about the mob's so-called little man, Meyer Lansky, that are not available anywhere else. Seriously, folks, this is a pretty great read. It contains a lot of great gems, and I will continue to return to it, as it does dive into some aspects of Lansky's life that are hard to substantiate elsewhere. Anyways, according to Mogul of the Mob, Meyer Lansky first befriended Cuban general and dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1932, a year before the end of Prohibition and, coincidentally, right before the 1933 Sergeant's coup in Cuba, which would install Batista as, on paper, the Army Chief of Staff, but in reality would put him in such a commanding position that he essentially would run the government until 1944. I should note here that between 1940 and 44, Batista did rule as a constitutional president, winning an election and serving one term, before re-emerging in 1952 after another military coup, overthrowing the aforementioned President Carlos Prio Socaras, which I mentioned a couple of episodes ago, and leading a brutal dictatorship until 1959. A bit of a whirlwind history there, just trying to get it all down. In 1959, of course, he was famously overthrown by Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries, as I've made very clear to this point. All that history aside, Batista from 1933 until 1959 was an immensely powerful figure in Cuba. And as it would have it, when he ascended to power in 1933, his new friend Meyer Lansky and his Syndicate sat ready to provide investment capital for his island, in return for a few concessions, that is. As relayed in Mogul of the Mob, sometime in 1933, after his pal Batista took power, Lansky convened a meeting at Lucky Luciano's grand suite at the Waldorf Towers in Manhattan. Assembled there, alongside Lansky and Luciano, were a real who's who of national crime figures. Bugsy Siegel, Lansky's number 2 since they were kids and a brutal killer. He was soon to be his emissary to Los Angeles and the expanding Hollywood scene. Also present was Mo Dalitz, the Cleveland mob boss who had been instrumental in organizing booze shipments from Canada across Lake Erie during Prohibition. This Cuban deal with Lansky would be just the start of a long career in gambling management for Dalitz, as he would much later come to be known as Mr. Las Vegas, for his significant holdings on the Strip, including the famous Desert Inn, which would later be purchased and lived in by Howard Hughes, as I covered back in my CIA Mafia Plots video. Also, according to a longtime Lansky associate, Doc Stacher, it was through Mo Dalitz that Lansky and the New York gangsters first met the infamous Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa, as he and Dalitz had met way back when Mo was still a young tough in Detroit's Purple Gang, and Hoffa himself was just starting his takeover of the Teamsters Union in the same city. Dalitz later left Detroit to become the boss in Cleveland, and Hoffa would eventually commandeer one of the mob's most significant piggy banks, the coveted Teamsters Pension Fund. I'm getting off track here though. Returning to the Waldorf meeting in 1933, rounding out the bunch was Phil Castell, another New York mafia figure who would eventually find his way to New Orleans, working to expand the New York Syndicate's reach into the South. Eventually, Castell would be forced to concede full control of Louisiana to rising boss Carlos Marcello, another major player in plots related to the JFK assassination later on. These men, convened at Luciano's suite, were the first mobsters to follow Lansky into Cuba in 1933, and thus bound their financial future to the continuance of gambling and smuggling on the Caribbean island. According to the book, each of these men agreed to chip in $500,000, a massive sum in 1933, to develop Lansky's vision on the island of Cuba. From the beginning, as the disparate organized crime factions across the US began to chip into the Havana gold rush, the entire structure's fate became bound to the gambling sector on the Caribbean island. For the next 2.5 decades, the gravy train would proceed without much of a hitch. According to the recollection of Lansky's main middleman in Cuba, a longtime associate, Joseph Doc Stacher, all the money was packed into suitcases and brought directly to Cuba and presented to the newly installed Batista. As told by Stacher, quote, Lansky took Batista straight back to our hotel, opened the suitcases, and pointed at the cash. Batista just stared at the money without saying a word. Then he and Meyer shook hands, and Batista left, end quote. And, quote, we gave Batista a guarantee of between $3 and $5 million a year, as long as we had the monopoly on casinos at the Hotel Nacional and everywhere else on the island where we thought tourists would come. On top of that, we promised a cut of our profits. End quote. This deal in effect allowed the National Crime Syndicate to gain an unprecedented level of influence on the island and a sanctioned monopoly on the gaming industry. Soon enough, mob-owned casinos started sprouting up across Havana. The already existing nightclubs soon featured mob-run casinos for extra profit, as Cuba was propelled into a true gambler's paradise. But none compared to the crown jewel of the mafia's new gambling empire, that being the casino in Havana's prestigious Hotel Nacional, owned and operated directly by Meyer Lansky and his towering brother Jake. The Hotel Nacional, beyond being the most profitable casino property in Havana, also acted as a sort of centerpiece for the mob throughout their Cuban period. Famously, in December of 1946, so just after World War II, Lucky Luciano, freshly freed from his imprisonment in upstate New York and now in exile in his home island of Sicily, was smuggled by his partner Lansky back to the Western Hemisphere, to Havana. The ostensible reason, according to Mogul of the Mob, was to celebrate the arrival of the mafia's favorite singer in Havana, Jersey's very own Frank Sinatra. But in reality, For a week in December of 1946, the Hotel Nacional was host to the first mob summit of the post-war years. The real purpose was to reaffirm Luciano's place as a top boss in the organization from his new faraway yet crucial post in Sicily. The whole apparatus of organized crime in America was gathered by Lansky for this hallmark event at the most prestigious hotel on the booming island. Included were Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Joe Profaci, Willie Moretti, Mike Miranda, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, and of course, Vito Genovese. As described in Mogul of the Mob, one by one, the old and young capos of the Syndicate approached Lucky, swore their loyalty, and offered him an envelope filled with cash, compensation from his time in prison. After the 1946 conference, the French heroin connection through the southern French port city of Marseille would really kick into gear, with many speculating that Luciano would have some role overseeing it and the Corsican mobsters who ran Europe's dope labs there into the early 1950s. In these days, as I mentioned in a previous part, much of the opium was coming from Turkey, via Lebanon, before the Golden Triangle was fully instrumentalized in Southeast Asia. Consequently, much of that Marseille dope would find its way to Cuban shores, something of a safe haven for mob activity and, incidentally, heroin smuggling. The Havana Conference could have very well been held to discuss just this paradigm. Another topic, which apparently disturbed Meyer Lansky, was the plans to kill Bugsy Siegel, his boyhood friend and longtime associate out in LA. Siegel had since the beginning of his career been a real loose cannon, and there was talk that he was embezzling mob funds for his own purposes from his new home base of Las Vegas. Interesting to note that Siegel was really one of the first of the American mobsters to venture out to the desert city, when it wasn't much more than a few disparate dusty streets. This side venture may very well have cost Bugsy his life, as by June of 1947, 6 months after the Havana Conference, Siegel was gunned down in the living room of a mansion he was renting for his girlfriend in LA, in what has become one of the most memorable mob hits in history. Most importantly, at the 1946 Havana Convention, was the supposed establishment of what has been termed now the National Crime Syndicate, an informal arrangement that had begun to crystallize first with Prohibition and then with Lansky's move to Havana in the 1930s. This was apparently enshrined at the Hotel Nacional during the week in December of 46. Quoting from Mogul of the Mob, quote, Luciano again emphasized the philosophy he and Meyer had worked out back in the 20s. Avoid bad publicity and dissension in the ranks. No unnecessary wars. End quote. This arrangement, avoid bad publicity, dissension, and unnecessary war, well, after the slaying of Bugsy Siegel anyways, did mostly hold up until at least the mid-1970s, as the first half of the Cold War proved to be a true golden era for the minted National Crime Syndicate. Cuba, and more specifically Havana, were key pieces of that, as until 1959, mob investments into the island's seemingly unending tourism boom continued without a hitch. Tampa, Florida's Santo Trafficante Jr., a close future associate of the CIA in their apparent assassination schemes against Castro, even moved to Cuba for a time subsequent to 1955. He came to be the second most prominent mob operator in Havana after the ubiquitous Lansky, owning the entirety of the Sans Souci Club, major portions of the Tropicana Club, and was even rumored to have put money forward for what was soon to be the next major centerpiece of the Havana scene, the Havana Hilton. Within these establishments would emerge several of the key players in not only the secret war against Castro, but also the JFK assassination canon. For example, managing Santo Trafficante's Tropicana Club was a man I mentioned previously, one Louis McQuilly. McQuilly would come to prominence later as he was revealed to have been a good personal friend of Lee Harvey Oswald's future assassin, Jack Ruby. According to his House Select Committee on Assassinations testimony, he had known Jack Ruby since 1951, meeting first at a Dallas restaurant. This friendship meant a lot to the future Oswald assassin, as according to Larry Hancock in his excellent book on the JFK assassination, Someone Would Have Talked, Ruby later stated that McQuilly was his quote-unquote idol. Ruby's long-standing partnership with McQuilly is indicative of the former's deep connections with the organized crime underworld, connections that were conspicuously left unexplored in the Warren Commission report. McWillie, and by proxy Ruby, had been involved in gun trafficking to Cuba during and even after the revolution, shipping guns on behalf of the mob to Castro. Although guys like Meyer Lansky got out of Dodge in the weeks before Castro took power in Havana, others such as Santo Trafficante Jr. stuck around to test the waters and see about working out a deal with the new premier. Things got rocky quickly for the Tampa mobster. Shortly after taking power, Trafficante was arrested by Castro forces and placed in detention for most of 1959. But I focus in today on Trafficante's imprisonment in Cuba for a different reason altogether. A little known fact is that the captured mob boss actually shared a cell with another familiar imprisoned person on the island. That was a man I focused on heavily last time, the dirtbag drifter himself, Loran Eugene Hall. Gerry Hemming, the mercenary leader, noted in 1964 that he first met his future associate Loran Hall while he was imprisoned following his insubordination weeks after first arriving in Cuba. Hemming likely knew Hall at this point only as the cellmate of the far more prominent Santo Trafficante. As stated in Hall's FBI file, quote, Hall shared a cell in the Cuban jail with Santos Trafficante, well-known gambler and hoodlum of Tampa and Miami, Florida. End quote. I want to note as well that later in this same document, Hemming claims that he would not meet Loran Hall again until January of 1963 in Los Angeles, nearly 4 years later. After that reunion in LA in 1963, Hall would follow Hemming back to Florida and become something of a hanger-on, or what you could call a groupie, around the Interpen crew. At least that's how Hemming portrays it. He does also deny that Hall was ever an actual member of Interpen, but I do have my doubts on that point. But that's for a later time. Now, besides slightly underselling Trafficante's significance, this report clearly indicates that Loran Hall had garnered some relationship with Trafficante by virtue of sharing a cell with him. This relationship would remain in place when both Hall and Trafficante would end up back in Florida. So let's put a pin in it for now. It will return. But even more surprising was the appearance of another key player at Santos and Loran Hall's jail cell in Cuba during this same period, and that being a gangster by the name of Ruby. According to Jim Hoogan in his classic book Spooks, citing a CIA report from the time during his imprisonment, Trafficante was, quote, frequently visited by an American gangster named Ruby, end quote. Given Jack Ruby's closeness to Louis McWillie, as we're going to see, an employee and operator for Santos Trafficante, we can pretty convincingly assume that it was in fact Jack Ruby that was visiting the Tampa hood in the Cuban prison. But if we remember, the mobster's cellmate was none other than Loran Eugene Hall, which raises another important question. Did Hall remember meeting Jack Ruby? Surely after the assassination and the subsequent slaying of Lee Harvey Oswald by Ruby himself, Loran Hall would have remembered his face from the Cuban prison, or at the very least his name. Why was this not asked during the Warren Commission when they interviewed Loran Hall? Within this one jail cell, we get intersections with two key factions, organized crime and the Interpen mercenaries, and yet it remained off the Warren Commission's agenda. More inconvenient facts swept under the rug. But turning the clock back now to 1959, during these tumultuous months after the revolution, Louis McWillie, reportedly alongside Jack Ruby, coordinated and personally participated in gun shipments to Castro from the southern US on behalf of Trafficante interests. Deep in the Warren Commission volumes, which themselves comprise thousands of pages of additional materials, in the last volume, we find a December 1st, 1963 FBI memo that names another associate within this tight gun-running operation, that being one Edward Browder Jr. Authors such as Daniel Hopsicker, in his book Barry and the Boys, identified Browder as one of the major pilots in this gun-running operation, including Ruby and McWillie. Browder happened to have valuable experience gun-running in preceding intelligence operations in the Caribbean. A 1955 FBI file placed one Edwin Browder Jr. as a pilot and gunrunner for both the CIA's Guatemalan coup d'etat, one PB success in 1954, and also as a runner for an attempted coup of Costa Rican President Jose Figueres Ferrer the next year. For this, he was caught in Mexico City with illegal weapons and imprisoned for a short time, which was the impetus for the FBI report in 1955. Thanks to Daniel Hopsicker's investigative work, we can confirm that the Browder who worked for the CIA on their coup in Guatemala and their attempted coup in Costa Rica was the same Browder who would fly planes for Jack Ruby and McWillie some 4 years later. An interview with Browder's son conducted by the author confirmed that they were indeed the same man. Now here we once again get the CIA's PB Success operation cropping up again, but also, more significantly, hints that there was a potential intelligence angle to this gun smuggling network. If you've been watching my content for a while, this should come as no surprise, especially as I am trying to flesh out this Gulf Coast ecosystem, as I call it, where allegiances seem to overlap infinitely. It is with the pilots in this milieu that we get the most indications of CIA involvement in these operations. We've already covered Browder, who flew for PB Success, which was a CIA operation, but I also want to remind you all of the future legendary CIA pilot and narco-trafficker Barry Seal, as shown by author Daniel Hopsicker, was also flying guns to Cuba in this very milieu. Additionally, Lee Harvey Oswald's suspected recruiter, Civil Air Patrol leader and suspected CIA asset David Ferry, was himself ferrying guns to Cuba during this very same period out of Louisiana. These three CIA-affiliated pilots, all rubbing shoulders with the mob-operated gun smuggling operations, hints at an earlier CIA-Mafia alliance on the Gulf Coast than the one I previously highlighted in regards to the future CIA-Mafia assassination plots against Castro. But still, these CIA-affiliated pilots and low-level mob guys like Ruby and McWillie were simply foot soldiers. They were the ones moving the goods, and likely their involvement started and ended there. The real links with US intelligence come one echelon higher, with the man who reportedly was overseeing and directing this whole complex, that being the mobster Norman Roughhouse Rothman. Roughhouse Rothman is, in my view, the key figure that links US intelligence and the Mafia during the Cuban Revolution. Born in New York but primarily based out of Florida, Roughhouse Rothman operated as Santo Traficante's gambling czar while also having close ties to Meyer Lansky from his early years in New York. Rothman came to manage all of Traficante's Havana casino properties, thus making him Louis McWillie's boss, while the latter was working as the pit boss at the Sans Souci Club. Rothman even came to own a portion of the Sans Souci, according to the book Warrior. On the side, Norman was in charge of arguably the most important aspect of the gun-running networks, the procurement of the arms. According to Hancock, Rothman was revealed to have been behind a major theft of 317 weapons from an Ohio National Guard armory on October 14, 1958, after they were intercepted by law enforcement in West Virginia en route to Florida on November 4, 1958. Sound familiar? I do want to note the peculiar timing of the interception of the stolen weapons. A little over 1 month later, in late December 1958, as we saw in the last part of the Road to Dallas series, Army Intelligence Lieutenant Colonel Jack Cannon would be found not guilty in his court-martial at Fort Hood, Texas, for apparently misplacing or stealing Army property. By early January, Cannon was in his new role as an ordnance officer with access to significant supplies of surplus Army weaponry. Could Rothman have shifted his smuggling activities towards Fort Hood and Jack Cannon, who potentially offered an easier supply of US Army gear? Well, given Norman Rothman's close ties to Frank Sturgis, this may have very well been the case. According to authors Larry Hancock, Jim Hunt, and Bob Risch, and Peter Dale Scott, Rothman acted as the primary emissary between the Mafia casino interests and Castro's new gambling czar, Frank Sturgis, throughout 1959 and 1960. The two would even remain close later, especially as both would relocate to Miami in 1960, with Rothman coming to own the Biltmore Hotel in Miami Beach, a future hotspot for mob activity. Now, it is through this Rothman-Sturgis link that I hope to illustrate the real broad strokes of these networks and how we are really starting to see the formation of a coalition of sorts. I want to turn your attention back to an Argosy magazine article from 1993 that I cited from before, where author Dick Russell interviewed Sturgis associate and mercenary outfit Interpen founder Gerry Patrick Hemming. One answer in particular I find quite significant. Russell asks Hemming whether he believes that the Mafia had a significant relationship with Jack Ruby and, by consequence, the JFK assassination. His answer to this seemingly simple question is quite peculiar. Hemming stated, quote, "Look, going back to things concerning the overthrow of Batista in 1958, the mob was trying to get their boys into Cuba. Sturgis, Johnny Devereaux, Jack Cannon, Herman Marx. They wanted people on both sides, here with Batista and with Castro. Later they operated the same way, trying to do hits against Fidel through 1959 and 1960. End quote. Understandably, Russell pushes back, asking, quote, "The mob was actually pulling those kinds of things in Cuba before the CIA's attempts on Castro's life?" End quote. And here's the key. Hemming responded, quote, "Well, let's say they all know one another. They get along. Quite a few of the people who had worked for the agency and had gotten into a little trouble went to work for people that knew mob people or Howard Hughes people. Everybody gets to know everybody else." End quote. I find this answer fascinating, especially in regards to the names that Hemming shared as the mob's so-called boys in Cuba. He names Frank Sturgis, who during this period was working for the Castro government, but also had ties to organized crime through Norman Rothman and potential ties to US intelligence, as we will come to see later. He named Johnny Devereaux, which is a mysterious man who many have alleged was the man who would later be photographed as posing as Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City in 1963. And if you're watching this on Patreon, you're lucky, because I hope to get a short Patreon exclusive video out on Johnny Mitchell Devereaux, specifically the strange allegations surrounding him. I had a section written in the last part about him that I had to take out, so I hope to repurpose that into a shorter part just talking about those allegations. It'll be a little bit more freewheeling, but it's still very interesting. Getting back to it. Hemming also, maybe most significantly to my investigation, named Jack Cannon as one of these so-called mob associates in Cuba, who we know from previous parts of this series was also posing as a tourist police officer at the time under the codename Jack Shea. More critically, Cannon was seemingly not a mob associate at all, but instead a roving military intelligence officer, Jack Cannon with one N, who had done work for the CIA in the past and who was very conceivably facilitating arms transfers from his arsenal at Fort Hood, Texas, to Cuba. But this association with organized crime is not out of character for the traveling army spook, actually quite to the contrary. I want to turn the clock back again to Colonel Jack Cannon's time in Japan after World War II, working in an army intelligence capacity there. There, Cactus Jack famously worked closely with members of the Japanese Yakuza, most notoriously the infamous Japanese crime boss and deep state operator Yoshio Kodama. General Charles Willoughby's G2 Army Intel contingent in post-war Japan, the unit that Cannon worked under, had helped secure Kodama's release from Tokyo's Sugamo prison in 1948. The senior Japanese mobster was uniquely suited as an operator, having deep ties in both Japanese far-right circles and Yakuza circles, before and during World War II. He was a significant player in China during the Japanese invasion throughout the latter 1930s. According to David Kaplan and Alec Dubrow in their book Yakuza, Japan's Criminal Underworld, Kodama organized the shipment of arms, radium, cobalt, nickel, copper, tungsten, and whatever other useful war materials to the home islands from his new fiefdom in China. His smuggling business, known as the Kodama Kikan, or Kodama Agency, had garnered an estimated valuation of $175 million by war's end, mostly gained from war plunder, be it diamonds, banknotes, and platinum from China. By the end of the war, Kodama was serving as a rear admiral back in Japan, advising the top imperial politicians in the final days of the war. He was imprisoned in 1946, rounded up with other major Japanese war criminals, only to be released after Willoughby and his deputy Cannon worked behind the scenes to bring him into the US fold. Kodama would remain the major post-war Japanese narco smuggler and one of Japan's top political fixers. He would even re-emerge in the 1970s as an off-the-book consultant to Lockheed in Japan, in order to sway the Japanese airline All Nippon Airways to buy the Lockheed L-1011, forming the Japanese component of the Lockheed bribery scandal, a scandal that I hope to get back to much later on, maybe in a future war conspiracy video. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. I promise we will get into all this much more thoroughly later when we loop back to Willoughby's time in Japan. All this to say, Canon had no qualms and actually thrived within organized crime circles. Yoshio Kodama was by no means the only Yakuza thug that Canon rubbed shoulders with in post-war Tokyo. With this context in mind, Hemming's revelation that he thought Canon was one of the so-called mob's boys in Havana is not too surprising. Canon was a chameleon, able to blend into whatever group he needed to work with. And given the mob's prominence in the surging gun smuggling networks into Cuba, Canon's appearance in close proximity to these networks that he would have been able to supplement with his Fort Hood connection, is almost self-evident at this point. With all that said, we really see the second part of what Hemming was saying in action. The fact that in the early days of Castro's Cuba, quote, everybody gets to know everybody else. As I am slowly revealing, post-revolution Havana was a melting pot of sorts, creating the linkages that would remain in place until November 22, 1963. It is within these arms smuggling networks to Cuba and beyond that we get the framework for the eventual assassination. The groundwork was being set, even before Jack Kennedy and his idealistic vision were on the purview. Thank you all for watching as always, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon for making these videos possible. On screen now are my producer tier patrons. The video you just watched was first made available to them on May 17, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content, get access to small Patreon bonus videos, and connect with me on a more personal level, please consider checking out my page on Patreon, linked below in the description. There you can find all of the upcoming videos this year, and my newest series premiering there right now, focusing on the history of modern Japan. All that and much more below. Recently, I've been writing like crazy over the past month, trying to get the script done for the final chapter of the History of Modern Japan series. I am hoping to start putting that video out in chunks over the upcoming weeks, as soon as I finish the script. This History of Modern Japan series has been a real passion project for me, and I thank you all over on Patreon for your patience as I wrap it up. The script for the last chapter has ballooned to something close to 60 pages so far, which is by far the longest video script I've ever written. There is so much interesting history to cover during Japan's Taisho and Showa periods, leading up to the Second World War. I don't think this history gets covered nearly enough in English, especially in comparison to Germany's pre-war history. So I want to do it justice, which is why I'm going so in-depth. I promise, if you are a fan of Japanese history or geopolitics in general, this final chapter will be well worth the wait. I also want to take this opportunity to especially thank you all here on YouTube for your outpouring of support for the Road to Dallas series. The final chapter, set to premiere next Friday, December 12th, is one of my personal favorite videos I've produced. As a capstone to the Cuban segment of the Road to Dallas, I turn towards an often overlooked figure in this nexus by the name of Frank Brandstetter, an Army intelligence officer turned manager of the Havana Hilton. There, in the illustrious hotel, we will see the intersection of nearly all the characters we've covered so far, in a story that I feel has been overlooked by many other researchers. As I said, that will be live here on YouTube next week. But for now, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you all for watching as always once again, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.